Today's going to be part 2, harmonic organization, which is going to be an incredibly important unit in terms of laying a foundation for both multiple choice questions and free response questions on the AP exam. So let's get right into it. So first of all, let's talk about what harmony is. It's basically just how many notes sound played at once. You are adding a vertical element to a melody. A counterpoint is just a single melody line added to another. Like for instance, Bach has a lot of pieces where there's counterpoint, there's many different melody lines on soprano, bass, different, yeah. Now, intervals, this is pretty much the basis of everything. An interval is the distance between two pitches, and it's described by both size and quality. With size, there is, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh, and also octave. With quality, there's major, minor, perfect, augmented, and diminished. Now, you can't have both major, minor, and perfect. Perfect is for first, fourth, fifth, and octave only, whereas major and minor is for the rest, second, third, sixth, and seventh. Quality-wise, perfect intervals, they're called perfect because they're the same in both major and minor. That's where they get the name from. Scale degrees 1, 2, 3, 6, and 7 have augmented and diminished for quality. That means that for augmented, if you have half a step larger than the diatonic scale degree that you hear in the key itself, it's augmented. And if it's half a step larger or lower, then that would be diminished. So here are just the basic symbols that you'll see for diminished and augmented. This will come up a lot, especially in figured bass during the AP exam. So make sure you keep these in mind. I will elaborate more on half diminished and what it means later in this video. So just keep an eye out. So the concept of an harmonic, whether it be intervals or keys, they still exist with intervals, basically just intervals that are spelled differently yet still sound the same. Like for instance, I have here diminished fifth and augmented fourth. They sound the same as an interval, but technically their size isn't the same, since one is a fifth and one is a fourth, even if they're diminished or augmented. Now, there also exists doubly augmented and doubly diminished intervals, which is basically just, if you think about it, 2 half steps raised and 2 half steps lowered, which is just a whole step. To identify intervals, you want to compare the top note in the interval to the diatonic version of the note, or what you would hear in the key signature scale of what you're looking at. And if it's a half step lower than what you would hear in the scale, then it's minor or diminished, depending on the scale degree. If it's a half step higher, then it's augmented. You might want to sing the scale to yourself in your head because it really helps you identify what the note should be, and compared to the diatonic note, it really helps me. So now, tips for identifying intervals. If both notes contain accidentals, they cancel out, and therefore the interval remains the same. This should be self-explanatory, but it can be kind of confusing for some people, so you might want to keep that in mind. And this too is one of those things that are sense-making, but also confusing at the same time. If the top note is raised by a half step, or more importantly, if the bottom note is lowered by a half step, you would think that lowering it makes the interval smaller, right? But no, it makes the interval larger, so it augments it, even though you're lowering the note. So that is definitely something to keep in mind, especially if that brings us to our next point. If the lower note isn't the name of a standard key, like for instance, G sharp, you don't really have a G sharp major because that would be too many accidentals. You should really just use the nearest key. For here, that would be A major, and then you would adjust the interval based on that. So G sharp to D, you would calculate that by using A to D, which would be a fourth, a perfect fourth. But since you're lowering the A to a G sharp by half a step, remember, even though you're lowering it, that's not going to be diminished, that's going to be augmented. So that's something that you can definitely keep in mind and use to determine your interval. Like I said before, it really helps to sing the scale in your head because it helps you visualize the interval. Compound intervals are just intervals that are larger than an octave. You basically can just subtract an octave in your head, or you can just skip to the next, the same note in a higher octave closer to the top note, so that you have an easier time identifying it as a simple interval, which is the opposite of a compound interval, just an interval smaller than an octave. So inverting intervals, this is basically just changing the order of it. The top note goes to the bottom and the bottom note goes to the top. So with inverting intervals, you want to really use the rule of 9, which means that to find the size of the interval, remember we have two portions, we have the size and the quality for naming intervals. You subtract the original size of the interval from 9, and then for the quality, perfect stays perfect, major turns to minor, and minor turns to major, augmented turns to diminished, and vice versa. So you basically just reverse it using these rules. For instance, a perfect fifth would invert to a perfect fourth, and a minor third would invert to a major sixth. So for interval stability, remember how we mentioned last time how there are some notes that are more active, more stable, more unstable than others, and there are notes that are more stable than others. So this kind of really relates here with consonant and dissonant intervals. With intervals, perfect first, perfect fifth, perfect octave, major, minor, third, and sixths, and occasionally perfect fourths. Those are all consonant intervals or stable ones. Basically just ones that sound good if you play it. They don't make you like want to cringe and hurry up and play a different note. Interval, I mean, that's how you know it's a consonant interval. With dissonant intervals, they're unstable, which means they want to resolve to a consonant interval, but we'll go over that later. That includes major, minor second, major, minor seventh, and all augmented and diminished intervals, as well as perfect fourth, especially when used harmonically above the bass. So like I mentioned a couple minutes ago, this really relates to the concepts of active and stable tones that we described last time. Dissonant intervals always resolve to consonant intervals. They want to resolve to such a more perfect interval. So let's move on to chords. Chords are really important for your free response questions on the AP. Triads are just 3-note chords made up of 2 thirds intervals. The notes are called the root, the middle, and the fifth, since that's what their intervals are from each other. Tertian harmony is harmony built on chords, triads more specifically. Always on lines or always on spaces for the notes, since they're thirds. For triad quality, this is pretty important in determining how you would name a triad. A major triad is a major third and a perfect fifth above the bass note. A minor triad is a minor third and a perfect fifth above the bass note. And of course, a minor third and a diminished fifth makes it a diminished triad. A major third and an augmented fifth makes it an augmented triad. So that's all for the basics of triads. Now, sevenths, they add another note to the triad, which is the seventh, obviously. Due to the seventh, which is considered a dissonant and unstable degree, all seventh chords are considered dissonant, so it always wants to resolve to the tonic. As for quality, a major seventh consists of a major triad, like we mentioned before, that's the major third and the perfect fifth, and a major seventh above that would make it a major seventh. A dominant seventh, be careful. This is the only place pretty much where you will see the existence of something called a dominant that's not a fifth pretty much. It's a dominant seventh is a major triad and a minor seventh. This is what you would probably think in your mind when you think about a dominant, about a seventh, really, any seventh. Like for instance, C, E, G, and B, that would be a dominant seventh. It's just what comes to mind first when you think of seventh. Now, minor triad, that's evidently a minor triad. Minor seventh. That's a minor triad and a minor seventh. And a half diminished seventh. This is a diminished triad and a minor seventh. Now, this is where the half diminished and fully diminished business comes in. Remember how I mentioned before how there was a symbol with basically a slash inside a circle? That's the symbol for the half diminished chords. The symbol is always pretty much written as a superscript in the upper right-hand corner of the symbol. So you want to always be on the lookout for that when there's figured bass or Roman numerals. So just like there's half diminished seventh, there's also diminished, fully diminished seventh, which consists of a diminished triad and a diminished seventh. So, let's do some practice. Can you name these seventh chords? They're all part of a scale, which is in this case C major, but they should be fairly evident based on what we've reviewed just now. Feel free to pause the video here and then quiz yourself on these. I'll reveal the answers in a moment. Okay, so let's take a look. The first one is a major triad with a major seventh. So that would make it a major seventh, like I mentioned before. You can just look at these and they're pretty self-explanatory. Notice how there's no fully diminished seventh here, because we don't have a diminished seventh in a normal major scale. So now let's go to chord inversions and inversion symbols. I've inserted a diagram here that really helps explain the idea of inversions, which is basically just rearranging the notes of a chord. You know how there's different intervals in a chord based on the interval above the bass note. With inversions, that's basically just playing around with which interval goes where. For instance, you have your root position chord triad, which is here. With figured bass, all the numbers represent is how many degrees it is above your bass note. So for 5/3, your middle note is a third above the root, or yeah, in this case, it's also the bass note, but normally the root. And the upper note, the top note, is evidently a fifth above the root note. So that is what you call root position. You don't really need a symbol for this since root position is just commonly written as a Roman numeral with nothing behind it, since that's what's easiest. Notice how root position isn't called first inversion. That's kind of just root position is what you call it. First inversion is really the second variation of how you could put your notes. So first inversion is having your middle note a third above the root note, which isn't your bass. And then the top note will be a sixth above the root note. And this is most commonly notated with only a sixth, since you don't really need the 3 behind it. Same thing for the rest of these. A 6/4 is second inversion for triads. You actually do need to write 6/4 for the figured bass most commonly used. You'll see these a lot during the FRQs that the AP will have. You'll often need to write out a 4-part harmony based on figured bass. So this is going to come up really often there. You want to familiarize with the symbols and the inversions that they represent. Let me just go over the rest of these really quick. This is for sevenths. This is just root position for a seventh, and this would be first inversion for a seventh, but you would call this 6/5, and then 6/4, 4/2. I meant 4/3 actually. 4/3, 4/2. Yep. There you go. So tips on how to remember these, because I know it can be kind of a lot, especially if you don't really memorize things too well. So there's a thing that helps you remember the symbols for these inversions, which is called the inversion hotline, because it really looks like a phone number for some reason. So just try to get yourself to remember this as a phone number: 664-765-4342. As long as you can recall this string of numbers, you'll be able to recognize all of the inversions, and that will make your life a whole lot easier when the FRQs come up. When you come across chords in music or in a written melody score, you want to first rearrange them in a snowman stack, also known as rearranging the notes back into root position so that everything is a third apart. It's just so that you can more easily identify them, since the bass note is at the bottom. So now let's move on to chords in a diatonic context. Let's review what diatonic means. I know I've mentioned this a few times already, but it just basically means the pitches found in the key signature you're referring to. A harmonic function of a triad is just relating the chord to the scale degree that you're in. For instance, a tonic triad, the triad whose bass note is the tonic of the key. That would be a tonic triad. They developed the Roman numerals for chords for these purposes, for relating chords to scale degrees of a key. So you have major triads indicated in uppercase Roman numerals, 1, 4, and 5, and minor triads will be represented by lowercase Roman numerals. Diminished and augmented, remember the symbols. Diminished is just the little degrees symbol, and augmented, you won't see this all that often, but it's a plus sign. This is actually also meant to be a superscript, except I couldn't find the setting for it in docs, so you'll just have to. So for diatonic triads in major, here is a really helpful graphic as to the major and minors of them. Notice how only the seventh is diminished. Diatonic triads in minor actually have the same exact qualities as they do in major, just in a different scale degree. So for instance, the diminished seventh chord I just mentioned in a major key, it carries over to a diminished second in its relative minor, since they're 3/2 steps apart, as you know. And also remember to raise the seventh in minor. As for diatonic seventh chords, note that there will be a superscript of 7 for seventh chords, obviously. Like for instance, you'll often see a V7, which just means like a 5/7 chord. If you're in the key of C, that would be a seventh chord starting with G. A half diminished seventh chord exists in major, and a half diminished second exists in minor, which is the same chord really as that of major. And so does a fully diminished seventh in minor, which, recall, it doesn't exist in major. It's really uncommon to use the 1, 3, 4, or 6 chords for seventh chords at all, seeing as that's not really characteristic of the period. All right, so now let's move on to realizing figured bass. This will show up a lot in the FRQs. Keep in mind the important steps that I mentioned. First, you want to organize the notes in a chord stack, and you also want to find and circle the bass note to keep it as a note for yourself. This is the scale degree I'm dealing with, and this is the note the chord is based around. So for chord function, this refers to the placement of the chord as relating to the key. Remember how last time we discussed active tones and stable tones? So this kind of goes back to that once again. Tendency tones are the more active tones, primarily degrees 4 and 7. They have a tendency to resolve by half a step to the resolution tones, which are the more stable tones 1 and 3, hence their name. The chord families, according to their function, are for tonic, there's 1 and 6. For subdominant or predominant, there's 4 and there's the diminished second. These are also transition chords, or chords that will connect your your tendency and resolution chords. There's also the dominant family, which is 5 and diminished seventh. The mediant chord, again, is barely used on the AP test, so you don't really have to worry about that. Here is a really nice visual to kind of show you the whole progression that usually takes place. In the common practice period, harmonies really oftenly progress in a tonic, subdominant, dominant, back to tonic fashion. So that is kind of like a triangle that repeats and repeats until the end of the piece. It's really common. You're gonna need to remember that for your harmonizing FRQ. Now, the last thing we're going to discuss today is cadences. This too is going to come up a lot, especially in multiple choice, actually. Well, both in multiple choice and in FRQs for harmonizing. Basically, they're just used at the end of a musical phrase as the feeling of tension release. It is signifying the rhythmic, harmonic, melodic end for the musical phrase. It also establishes the tonal center, which helps you ensure and be confident about the key of the melody. So here's how to determine cadence. There are many of these, so make sure you remember each one of them as you're going to be asked to identify them very often. If it ends with 1, well, most of them end with 1. If it ends with 5 to 1 or 5, 7 to 1, these are most common and they are what's called an authentic cadence. If both the 5 chord and the 1 chord are in root position, this is a necessity, as crazy as it sounds. You need to be sure that it's in root position for it to be a perfect authentic cadence. And if it's a 4-part voice thing, you also need the soprano to have the bass note doubled. Otherwise, if the conditions are not met for it to be in root position and such, or if it's actually leading tone to 1 and not 5 to 1, it's an imperfect authentic cadence. If it ends with 4 to 1, it's called a plagal cadence. You'll often hear this in, I think, church music, so that's also a really obvious signal to keep in mind. If it ends with a 5 to a 6, that is a deceptive cadence. This is the only one that's going to end with a 6th. So that also is something that helps you make it more obvious. If it ends with a 5 or a 5, 7, if it does, then you have to also check. If it's in harmonic minor and it goes 4 to 5, then it's a Phrygian half cadence. If not, it's just a half cadence. So that's all for today. The content we discussed today is actually really crucial to your success on the AP music theory test. So it's very important that you review most of these concepts. You want to practice identifying these intervals, cadences, as much as you possibly can, since they're really the building blocks of everything else you will need in music theory. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.